Good evening. It's certainly very good to be back with you all again tonight and have another opportunity to speak. I'm certainly very thankful for that opportunity and want to apologize for that misunderstanding earlier. Aaron walked up to me to ask how long I needed him to fill in the time, and I thought he was asking me how long my lesson was, so we had a bit of a miscommunication there, so that's on me, but I'm thankful to be up here anyway. And certainly to be doing the last lesson for this month's theme of the nature of God and studying what that is and what it looks like. And I've certainly been thankful to be here for most of those lessons. They've all been very good learning opportunities, certainly for me. And so tonight, with one more here, I want to look at one more aspect regarding what it means to live with that understanding by looking at the nature of God's mercy in sacrifice. Sacrifice is something we hear a lot about in any age, certainly in the modern one. We typically, in the world now, hear about sacrifice as it relates to success. We'll hear people who have great athletic feats and professional athletes talk about the sacrifices they made in their training. We'll hear professional musicians talk about the sacrifices they made in paying their dues and honing in their craft and playing all kinds of gigs that no one seemed to care about them at. Or we hear about people who are very successful in their businesses talk about how they had to start by making sacrifices and build a computer in their garage or whatever it was that got them to where they are. And that resonates with people very clearly, both in literal biographies of successful people, but even in the way we draw character arcs in our stories and everything in culture, because there's clearly a part of life that we understand that where there's a truth to it, where if we want to get to a different future and a more desirable future, that means we have to give up something now. We have to sacrifice something. And typically, we associate the higher the sacrifice, then the higher the reward. And there's some very foundational truth in that basic human understanding that we all know the Bible is very vocal about. And sacrifice is clearly a central part of the Bible from the beginning. One of the first things the very first generation born into a broken world starts doing with Cain and Abel is they start sacrificing. And it's when those sacrifices aren't accepted that becomes the basis for the first vindictive murder that Cain carries out in his fallen countenance. Throughout the Old Testament, sacrifices are the basis for the atonement of the Israelites. And of course, in the New Testament, sacrifice is the basis of Jesus' mission for our sakes while he's on earth. And so God is constantly emphasizing throughout the Bible and throughout the entire set of historical accounts he's giving us is that you need to give something up in order to be close to him and, of course, to understand his nature. And so with that in mind, and that clear truth about the Bible, I want us to take a look at a seemingly confusing statement made by Jesus in the Gospels on two different accounts. We're going to look at those in Matthew tonight, in Matthew chapter 9. Twice, Jesus uses this phrase. I want to look at the first one in Matthew chapter 9. You can go ahead and put a marker in Matthew. We're going to be pulling a few passages from that book tonight. First one here is in Matthew chapter 9. And starting in verse 9, it says, "As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, 'Follow me.' And he rose and followed him. And as Jesus reclined at a table in his house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, 'Why does your teacher eat with the tax collectors and sinners?' But when he heard it, he said, 'Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners.'" And so we see this phrase, "I desire mercy and not sacrifice." First time is when he's being questioned about the associates that Jesus hangs out with. You turn over a few pages in Matthew chapter 12, and he uses that exact phrase again when being addressed a different time by the Pharisees. Matthew chapter 12, starting in verse 1, it says, "At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath.' And he said to them, 'Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And so once again we see when he was questioned about the legality of how he conducted himself on the Sabbath, he brings up the same phrase. And he brings it up right before Matthew tells us about the account where he made a similar point in healing a man on the Sabbath in a synagogue. And so there's not many phrases Jesus is recorded to have quoted twice in refuting two different arguments against him. So it's worth asking, what point is he trying to make with this quote? And perhaps the first thing to address in asking that question is, what point was Jesus not trying to make with that quote? And Jesus was not making the point that sacrifices are irrelevant before God. Quite the opposite. Clearly, our God is a God of sacrifice, and he's one that demands the best sacrifice. And we can tell that through the Old Testament. If you look at the requirements of the first collective sacrificial action that Israel took as a nation, you can look at the Passover in Exodus chapter 12, where there's this principle, if you'll turn there, Exodus chapter 12 and starting in verse 5, there's this principle where you're looking at the requirements that God is setting up that are going to continue throughout the law. He has this principle established where to offer to God, you offer the best of your flock. And in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 5, when giving them the stipulations of how to carry out the Passover, he says to them, your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. And so in this establishment of the Passover, you can see that pattern follow along, and all the different burnt offerings that came along, the peace offerings and the atonement offerings and things like that. That principle continues for the Israelites, that you give up the best to God in order to get his mercy on your head and your household. And you see that carry through Jesus' sacrifice as well, and the significance of that. We've been studying the Hebrews class upstairs, and Hebrews has quite a bit to say about that. In Hebrews, well, throughout the whole book. We'll look at Hebrews chapter 9 for tonight. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 22, talks about that sacrifice. The Hebrews writer says in Hebrews chapter 9, and in verse 22, he says, indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year, with blood not his own, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once and for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ has been offered to bear the sins of many, and will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. And so we see that Jesus, and throughout the whole book of Hebrews makes this case, is that Jesus was able to make the perfect sacrifice once and for all because he himself was without blemish and perfect. And therefore, he was the highest possible sacrifice sent for the highest possible good outcome in the face of God. So, clearly, sacrifice, and a high sacrifice, is essential to the entire establishment of our faith in the Bible. So why is it that Jesus is saying that God desires mercy and not sacrifice? So let's look at the passage where that quote came from in the first place, in Hosea chapter 6. If you look in Hosea chapter 6, this is the book Jesus is quoting here on both occasions. In Hosea chapter 6. And the major point of Hosea's mission as a prophet was to directly live out how God felt in his relationship with his people. That's why Hosea is told to marry a harlot at the beginning of the book, and every one of the kids he has, God names after his different judgments and rejections of his people. And like most of the other prophets, Hosea is written in a way where it's a mix of condemning the behavior of Israel and Judah, along with calls to repentance and expressions of hope for a coming restoration, sort of moves in that cycle. But in Hosea's case, there's just a more personal touch for him because he can literally feel the pain that God is feeling playing out in real time in his own life. And so it gives him sort of a unique perspective as a prophet. And so the context coming into chapter 6 here, where this verse is is that he's just talked about the impending judgment on Judah and Israel. And in chapter 5 here, in verse 15, it ends with the phrase, in their affliction, they will seek me. And so you start to read chapter 6, and he says this in verse 1 of chapter 6 in Hosea. Come and let us return to the Lord, for he has torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, that we may live in his sight. Let us know, let us pursue the knowledge of the Lord. His going forth is established as the morning. He will come to us like the rain, like the latter and former rain to the earth. O Ephraim, what shall I do to you? O Judah, what shall I do to you? For your faithfulness is like a morning cloud, and like the early dew it goes away. Therefore I have hewn them by the prophets, I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and your judgments are like light that goes forth. For I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. But like men, they transgressed the covenant. There they dealt treacherously with me. So some places, in some translations, in the place of mercy, it has steadfast love, which is still synonymous with mercy. But here's clearly Israel and Judah's problem in Hosea's day, and in the rest of the prophet's day, really, is that they are carrying out at least some of the right rituals in the law, but they entirely forgot what the point of them was in the first place. And there's a reason Jesus pulls that into the same context he's in when he's addressing the Pharisees in his ministry. And so we see in the Old Testament and the New Testament that part of God's nature is that he's concerned more with the why behind our behavior than what the behavior is, because it's from the why that we carry out the proper what in the first place. And sacrifice, or any worship that we conduct at all, is meaningless, in fact, without mercy. And that's true right through the end of times. Jesus points that out in his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, if you'll turn back to Matthew. Matthew chapter 7, you get that verse in the Sermon on the Mount that's taken out of context fairly frequently by Christians and the rest of the world to make it mean things it does not. But in Matthew chapter 7, you get what ought to be a pretty sobering passage to us when he says in verse 1 of Matthew chapter 7, "Judge not, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye?" And so that's a reminder that God's judgment on me is based off how I show, and therefore how I understand, his mercy. And so I have to have that mercy, and to practice that mercy is actually to understand sacrifice itself at its highest. Because mercy is in fact the giving up of an opportunity to carry out my own flawed sense of justice. It's equivalent to the sacrifice of our own mindset and motivation to God's. And that's literally what the Old Testament sacrifices were meant to represent and meant to teach the Israelites, was that element of God's mercy. And as we just read that section in Hebrews 10 talks about how all those sacrifices were a shadow of the things to come and Jesus' sacrifice. And now our sacrifices are meant to echo his. And so to understand God's mercy is to be willing to give up what I find most important in order to come closer to him. To understand his mercy is to make a proper sacrifice. And to recognize that, in fact, Jesus and his mercy is actually the highest good. And so when we look at that, then the demand for the best of your flock that he establishes there in Exodus, that actually hasn't changed in principle. Not at all. He still demands the best of our flock, even if that manifests itself in different ways. And history and scripture are very good at showing us how bad we are at allowing any number of things to stand in the way between us and closeness with God's nature, often without even willing to recognize that we are holding something back that needs to be sacrificed. And that's exactly what Jesus shows someone, and a great example of how this works, in Matthew 19, in the rich young ruler. That's who we're going to be looking at for most of the rest of the lesson here. Is in Matthew 19, you see this play out directly in one conversation with the rich young ruler. Matthew chapter 19, starting in verse 16 of Matthew chapter 19. "Now behold, one came and said to him, 'Good teacher, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life?' So he said to him, 'Why do you call me good? No one is good but one, that is God. If you want to enter into life, keep the commandments." He said to him, "Which ones?" Jesus said, "You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and your mother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." The young man said to him, "All these things I have kept from my youth. What do I still lack?" Jesus said to him, "If you want to be perfect, go and sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me." But when the young man heard that saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Assuredly I say to you that it is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And again I say to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven." When his disciples heard it, they were greatly astonished, saying, "Who then can be saved?" But Jesus looked at them and said to them, "With men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible." Then Peter answered and said to him, "See, we have left all and followed you. Therefore, what shall we have?" So Jesus said to them, "Assuredly I say to you, that in the regeneration, when the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, you who have followed me will sit also on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold and inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first." And so we see Jesus expound there in the last part of that chapter on this lesson he taught everyone through this young man. But in a really quick conversation, he goes from this man being all right with God to backing him into a corner. And in doing so, Jesus shows this rich young man that he had not actually made the highest possible sacrifice. And what he's trying to get him to realize is that what he valued most was actually going to be the most effective route to understanding God's mercy if he gave it up. Because he tells him to give to the needy. What better way to show God's mercy by handing out what he thinks are his own possessions to people who, in his eyes, don't necessarily deserve it. And so we see the law and the prophets and Jesus' role in all of them all coming to a head in what they mean for this young man's soul here in this account. And that's the same position you and I are in when we're trying to figure out what we're supposed to do under the watch of God. And so like this man, we know that we're called to sacrifice some things to God, and we're called to sacrifice ourselves as Christians. And perhaps even we pride ourselves on the things that we have sacrificed so far, or even on our upkeep of the things we're supposed to do like this man, and making sure we check the right boxes. But if Jesus were to back me into a corner, and if he plans to use me, there's a high likelihood he will, maybe more than once, it's worth me asking, what is he going to ask me to sacrifice in order to better understand his mercy and the nature of his mercy? Because like the rich young ruler, we tend to let God be blocked by one or two things that we hold in too high esteem, without realizing that, in my case, to hold anything of mine, I put that in heavy quotes because it's not really mine, but anything that I regard as mine in too high regard is to hold God and his mercy in too low of a regard. And so we need to beg the question, what is standing in the way of our understanding of the phrase, "I desire mercy and not sacrifice"? What matter of the heart is holding us back? Because it could be any number of things. And this specific case here, and what Jesus really hones in on at the end of this chapter, is a matter of lifestyle. Because we see the rich man here, and we find him when he's coming to Jesus, he's comfortable. He's comfortable with his possessions and his resources, and his status all provide this certain quality of life and security. And we can see how that would be hard to give up, because we can all sympathize to some extent with human vulnerability. But I still don't really think that's necessarily giving it enough credit. Throughout the Bible and history, you see this truth portrayed. Well, it's actually in a book that was written in the 1500s by an Italian diplomat named Machiavelli. Some of you may have read it. It's on my list of ones I need to read. It's called The Prince, and it's basically a laying out of how political rulers of Europe at the time would defend their way of life and their quality of life and their power to the point where they were willing and able to sacrifice anything in order to keep their lifestyle in place or to advance it. And the truth that book hit on and exposed to the political spheres of then and now is that for the ruler, the ends always justify the means. And that becomes obvious in the political sphere. It becomes obvious today, and there's plenty of complaints we can make about the political, climate and what people are willing to do in order to keep power. What is harder to realize is that same principle can also just as easily apply to me. And there's people everywhere, myself included, who are all too willing to just as desperately defend their lifestyle as they are to defend their own life. And that's exactly the instinct that Jesus is tapping into here. He's asking this rich young man to give up his lifestyle and his way of life. And that can be easy for me to point out, like I said, in plenty of other spheres, in plenty of other areas. It can be easy for me to point out in people who are doing better than me. It can be easy to point out in corrupt governments and in historical figures that we get to kind of judge from our present and enlightened age. But I shouldn't forget that I too, especially in the modern age, have reaped the benefits of American prosperity. And I need to be careful about just what and maybe even who I am willing to sacrifice to keep the way of life that I've gotten used to here. Because the creature comforts that come with living in a first world may be more compelling to me and may have a better grip on me than I'm really willing to admit. Because, and I don't know if this is a uniquely American thing or not, but we tend to qualify this story a lot of times. I'm not saying anyone here has done this, but as Christians sometimes we tend to qualify the story, and I tend to qualify the story by saying, well, look, God isn't asking me to give up all my stuff, and maybe he's not, but maybe he will, especially if I keep saying that because I'm afraid that that's exactly what God's going to ask me to do. And I keep making sacrifices in order to keep my lifestyle and my stuff around me. And so by observing this rich young man, perhaps it'd be more appropriate to observe him as Tim and not the rich young man. But there are plenty of other subtle, sneaky, conniving, false gods that can be beckoning my sacrifices all the time that I hold in too high esteem. Perhaps it's something like success itself, which usually has, echoes of pursuing, the glory of God and things like that, that can get mistaken for our own glory. There's a famous speech, at least I think it's famous, from a valedictorian a few years ago that went viral on YouTube, who got up during his commencement speech. I'm not sure what they call the valedictorian speech in high school. I wasn't a valedictorian, clearly, but he gets up to make his speech and basically tells the whole audience that he had sacrificed everything to make sure he was at the top of his class. He had given up relationships. He had given up different kinds of learning opportunities. He had given up time with his family. And he finally got the valedictorian thing at, a school meeting or something. And there's, all these cheers. And he was so ecstatic. He got his piece of paper and his cord. And there's like a name tag on his seat for him. And he sat down. And he said after about 15 seconds of being ecstatic about it, he felt super empty. And what he realized is that he didn't actually have anything in mind of what it would feel like. He just figured once he made valedictorian, he would have made it, and that would be it. And what he realized is that he had made a lot of the wrong sacrifices for the wrong thing. And so the rest of his speech became a call to his classmates to beckon them to pursue things that would be worthwhile at the 16th second. And that was the whole theme of his speech. And what he's showing there is that there's any kind of markers of success that we make sacrifices for all the time. It doesn't have to be valedictorian. Maybe it's a certain idea of what retirement is like without having any idea of what to do after retirement. Maybe it's a certain promotion at work. Maybe it's a certain status socially among friends. Anything. Any kind of lofty goal that I decided was important without really much understanding of what that goal was in the first place, or why it was important, certainly why it was important in the face of serving God. And that's partly because psychologically studies have been done that show that humans are actually more driven by the pursuit of a goal than they are the actual achievement of a goal. I'm convinced that's because God designed us to not actually reach our real final goal while we're here, just imitations of it. And we're always in pursuit of what the final goal is. That's what I'm convinced of, but there's no use in waiting and keep pursuing the day here when we make it, when God is telling us that we don't actually make it until we're finally with him. That's what's going on. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's going back to the Sermon on the Mount and judge that you be not judged. Maybe there's something like my sense of justice that can very quickly become an excuse for vengeance. Maybe it's the next bit of drama or excitement to distract me from being with my own thoughts that actually reveal what's wrong with me. Maybe it's a form of art or an athletic pursuit, like we talked about in the beginning of the lesson, that really becomes an ego project more than a reminder of who those skills are actually supposed to call back to. Maybe it's something specific in my lifestyle that has a hold of me, like, entertainment or food or leisure or whatever. Maybe it's an avoidance of conflict. Maybe it's a creation of conflict. Maybe it's even, you take it to the extreme, and some ideologies that have risen up and gained more popularity nowadays, maybe even it's in the determination for everything to be meaningless. And it's because as crushing as that ideology is, and one that's kind of reared its head again, it does make whatever sins I carry weightless if they don't mean anything at the end of times. And that's the whole appeal of nihilism. And that's a lesson of its own. But the point is, there's any number of things that can subtly be demanding my sacrifices that I don't give nearly enough credit for. Because to aim for and sacrifice for anything that is below an understanding of the mercy of God is to blind myself to the log that's sticking out of my own eye, like Jesus talks about. Because, again, getting back to different psychological studies have been done to show that what humans and what we tend to aim at is actually literally what we see. Because our brains are designed really mostly to block information than take it in, because there's too many things going on that would overwhelm us if it tried to take us all in at once. So your brain picks a target, and it blocks out everything else that it regards as irrelevant to that target. And they did a study to show that, where they brought a bunch of people into a room and had them watch a video of people in white shirts and people in black shirts passing basketball back and forth. And they told them, okay, you need to count how many times the people in the black shirts pass the basketball back and forth. And they said, okay, and they would watch the video, and they say, okay, how many did you count? 12, whatever. And they say, okay, that's right. Did you notice the gorilla walk through the room? And a large amount of the contestants said, no, what are you talking about? What gorilla? And they play the video back, and sure enough, there's this guy in a gigantic gorilla costume who walks through the middle of the shot, stands there for like 5 seconds, beats his chest and everything, and then walks off. And a sizable amount of the participants never noticed the gorilla. And it's because their brain had picked out a specific target that they needed to see and blocked out everything else that was irrelevant to it, including this dude in a gorilla costume. And that means, for our purposes as far as sacrifice, that also translates not just into what we literally see day to day or on a computer screen. It translates into our actual vision, not just for our life, but also for eternity. And that means what I am aiming at is also not only what I see, but what I end up sacrificing for, whether I plan to or not. And that means if I can tell that something in me is empty and something is wrong, perhaps there's something wrong with my aim that has blinded me to the gorilla in the room, or the log in my eye, or the understanding that I clearly lack that I should have been pursuing all along. And so you go back to Hosea, and Israel's constant adultery in that book and everywhere else in the prophets is to us a more obvious example of what we do with a lot more subtle gods that we sacrifice to now. And for the rich young ruler, he was aiming at comfort in the law in a physical lifestyle, and he should have been aiming for steadfastness and comfort in the nature of God's mercy at the end of the day. And that would have had him much more willing to drop everything, in the same way it would have me much more willing to drop everything. Because the rest of what he was worried about giving up would have been given back to him as it were meant to be, Jesus says in 19, 100-fold at the end of the day. And so you notice Jesus, in Mark's account of this too, in Mark 10:21, Mark says that Jesus, before asking him to give everything up and give it to the poor, it says that he loved him, which shows us that Jesus is not vindictive in his request of the rich young man. And it means that if he loves me, it's actually pretty likely that he's going to ask something just as difficult of me in order to really teach me his nature and the nature of his mercy. And again, it's easy to see what one thing or two things or dozen things someone else lacks, but it's a lot harder to see it in ourselves. Just like it's hard to see when we're faced with giving up something we value and we're holding it in high esteem, it can be easy for us to forget, easy for me to forget, that God never calls us to sacrifice anything that we are not already bound to lose in the first place. Because death claims it all back, whether it's stuff or lifestyle or abilities or brain or brawn or relationships or associations, accomplishments, right down to our own thoughts and our dreams and our intentions. It's all delivered back to God, and we don't get to keep any of it. And ultimately, it's judged by God. And so it's in my best interest, and all of our best interest, to aim all of what we have around us and all the talents that God has placed in our possession towards understanding his mercy. Because I have to understand how badly I'm going to need that mercy in return. And that's why Matthew 7 says, whatever measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And so that's why also in Matthew 9, when he first says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, to make a point about who he's associating with, he was associating with sinners who understood that they were sinners, because it is sinners who understand their own nature, who understand the nature of God's mercy, and who are willing to make sacrifices for it. And that's exactly what he called all his disciples to. And that's exactly what he calls you and me to. Now, that begs the question, is it wrong, then, for us to sacrifice in order to develop a certain skill, or to accomplish a goal, or to preserve a relationship, or to better ourselves physically, or to create something that's good? And the answer is, of course, no. But it is wrong, and that becomes wrong, when we forget the ultimate aim of any pursuit that we end up sacrificing for. And that ultimate aim is to glorify God and to come to a better understanding of his nature and what we're pursuing. And that's why you can see God's greatest gifts to us go so badly wrong when that aim is forgotten. It's when you see intellect become a worship of the self. It's when you see any kind of art become a worship of the self. It's when you see our ability for industry become a massive temple to greed. It's when you see money become an avenue for greed. It's when you see empathy become an avenue for understanding how to be incredibly cruel. You can't be cruel without a sense of empathy, because you have to know what would hurt you in order to hurt someone else. And so, even when God seems silent and the world chaotic and God's plan confusing and his sacrifices he calls us to lofty or even impossible, it's in our pursuit of understanding his nature and making sacrifices for that understanding that keeps us grounded in the context of why we act the way we do as Christians. And that's exactly what Paul gets at in Romans chapter 11, if you'll turn there. Romans chapter 11. The context for this passage is, well, Romans is obviously a very, very dense book. And this chapter, and this section we're about to read, is plenty dense as well. But leading up to this part of Romans, Paul's been talking about God's calling to all and his grafting the Gentiles into his tree, and the mercies on our disobedience, and the way he's able to show his mercy through our disobedience, and the destiny he lays before us in following Christ. And it's all getting at the strange and unknown and beautiful way that he works. And so you look in chapter 11 of Romans, starting in verse 33, that's exactly what he starts getting at here. In verse 33 of Romans chapter 11, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has become his counselor, or who is first given to him, and it shall be repaid to him? For of him and through him and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Amen. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and the perfect will of God." And so clearly, when God calls us to make sacrifices, he doesn't work in the way we think he's going to. And that's why we're in a constant pursuit of understanding him. And we do so, Paul tells us in Romans, with the sacrifice of ourselves, of our whole selves. And that includes that one thing that we lack, that one roadblock that makes us uncomfortable about giving up. And that's exactly what's going on in baptism. That's a full burial and renewal of self by God's power. It's putting to death the old man and a sacrifice of the old self. So the question is, for me and you, after studying all month about God's nature, is what are you and I willing to sacrifice to better understand God's nature and therefore his mercy? Because we can't have a proper sacrifice without understanding mercy, and we can't understand mercy without a growing understanding of God. So it's important to address the question of what could be holding us back from that. And if God were to back you or me into a corner tonight, What would he call out? Because it may not even be obvious. You know, the logs in our eyes rarely are obvious to us. That's why Jesus constantly has to point that out. Still. And so Jesus forces us to see clearer by calling us to higher sacrifices. So it's worth my time to consider not just what I have given up to God so far, but what is still holding on to me that lessens my value of God's mercy on me. And that's a growing process. And it's one that, like anything else, it requires time and it requires practice. And so my question for all of us tonight, my question to you, is like the rich young ruler. What do you lack? What do you need to do to better understand the words, I desire mercy and not sacrifice? How well are you able to empathize with Christ's mercies and his sacrifices? Because no one understands that principle, and no one understands what it's really like to lose everything and to give everything up the way Jesus does. And so tonight, despite how much more we have to learn about God and his nature and his mercy and our sacrifices, here's something that is abundantly clear. No matter your position in life, you and I are all in need of God's mercy and a growing understanding of it. And his mercy is something that's too deep for us to simply check off and understand that he is merciful and move on. It's a constant learning process. And you and I are all in need of making higher and higher sacrifices to present to God in order to understand that. Sacrifices only possible by God's mercy. Those sacrifices don't earn us anything. He's the one who atones us. But he uses them to inch us closer to our ultimate eternal goal in being unified with his nature and his mercy in heaven. And that starts and always comes back to the sacrifice of self and taking up the cross of Christ. So tonight, if you're ready to begin your walk as a Christian and putting to death the old man in baptism, or you need to give yourself back up to Christ and put to death whatever's still holding on to you, this is your invitation now to step into an aisle and to make your way to the front as we stand and as we sing.
Would you